Well, it sure was fun last time, nearly a year ago, to delve into one of Yu-Gi-Oh's best structure decks ever made, wasn't it? Well, enough being happy, I guess. Welcome back to Structure Deck Scrutiny, everyone, where I dive into the old piles of cards thrown together by some likely underpaid Konami staffers just because they share a type and see what can be salvaged. If that sounds more cynical than usual, that's because for the next few linear episodes of this show, I've got to suffer through some of the worst structure decks Konami have ever made. Yes, while our first 5 decks only really produce one complete dud, the next 4 decks are at best mediocre and at worst completely awful. Yes, this is the point where for a couple of years the structure decks just became starter decks with better synergy and less staples, with little to offer a competitive player. Thankfully, we're going to have a small mercy today as we're starting with the least bad of the 4 in Spellcasters Judgement. As the name suggests, Spellcasters Judgement focuses on the spellcaster type, like Warriors Triumph did for Warriors, which yes, does mean that this deck has many good individual monster reprints that were useful elsewhere, as even if their actual decks kind of sucked for the most part, both Yugi and Joey favourite monster types did pretty well in the DM era of the TCG. However, much like Warriors Triumph, these powerful individual cards are placed in the shell of a structure deck with a very mediocre out-of-the-box game plan that, unlike Warriors Triumph and every previous deck we've covered, not named Dragon's Roar, had very little correlation with the staples included and required a lot of work to make playable, usually involving stripping most of the deck's cards out, essentially making this more of a staple reprint pack than an actual deck. In this case, the staples are actually doing their best to support 2 sub-themes in this deck that somewhat overlap. 1, the use of spell counters, which as the name suggests are counters you get usually by playing a ton of spell cards, and 2, burn effects. They either use spell counters to burn or require some form of magic to work, either synergizing with spell cards or spellcasters. Now, spell counters are a mechanic of Yu-Gi-Oh! I really like, but sadly, until fairly recently, they have for the most part been awful in practice. Now, someone whose preferred gameplay style is slow and grindy control in mid-range decks, a mechanic that rewards you for playing certain cards by storing a resource that can be cashed in later in the game is very appealing to me, as it can be done to ensure no matter what, you'll always have something to do on the later part of the game. Sadly, most spell counters were rarely used for this purpose, most often only serving as either a way of keeping track of how long a card's been out, and how close it is to being able to use an effect, or as a reminder of a card's limited uses of an effect. Now, we've seen in recent years with the likes of Endymion and Mythical Beasts that this can work. However, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh, the mechanic literally had 2 cards see play, one of which was play for its stats with the spell counter theme being completely irrelevant, and the other one being a card who only uses a spell counter to signify it can only use its effect once. That's it. Now, burn strats, on the other hand, as we've seen in both this show and Goat Guides, were very powerful around this time, with Panda Burn and Panda Stein hybrids being 2 of the best decks of the recently finished Goat format, or at least the modern version of it. But the problem with this deck is that not only is the burn here fairly minimal, with only 4 real burn effects, but it's also this really bad burn, with low damage and one repeatable burn spell that takes years to kill someone. To quote Hyde's audio drama about this deck, Spellcasters Judgement, they sent you to die, eventually. Now, this instead of this deck is worthless. Like I said, it's got some really good value for its time. However, most of that value comes from building a completely different deck to the one presented in the pre-con, with all of that value being individually strong cards that were in this deck, just because they were spellcasters rather than from the overall package. So let's see why as we look at this deck straight out of the box. To give you an idea what this deck is all about, let's, like we usually do, take a look at the deck's boss monster in Dark Radicator Warlock, who instead of looking like an awful JRPG boss, is a monster with Damage Magician stats that requires the original Damage Magician as a tribute to bring it out. So it's another monster that requires a one specific card to get it out, and both it and the monster needed are hard to find. So it's kind of dead on arrival, but let's carry on to see what this card could do if we could get it out fairly easy. Well, when he gets to the field, he inflicts 1000 points of damage to the opponent each time either player activates a normal spell. Okay, that's a pretty good effect. So this card showcases both the best and worst parts of this deck. On one hand, this is by far the most powerful burn card in the deck, and if a player manages to summon this card and make it stick on the field, they will likely win very fast. In fact, if this guy was like Flame Emperor and only required 2 tributes to bring it out, he would be the best boss we've covered so far, which brings us to the downside of this card, in that like most of this deck, it's infuriatingly slow, requiring a tribute to Dark Magician to summon him, making him almost as slow as Red Eye's Darkness Dragon. Just to give you an idea on how hard it was to get this guy out, let me explain the best process here. You need to 1. Either tribute summon Dark Magician from hand, or get it from the deck with skill Dark Magician. 2. Protect Dark Magician to hard draw this card, as at the time it was basically unsearchable. And then 3. Summon this card, let it stick around for a couple of turns to make use of the effect, while praying your opponent doesn't have any form of removal, like Regeki Break, or God forbid, a Phoenix Wing Wind Blast. Yes, these were the same complaints I had with Dark Magician Knight, thanks for remembering, and it's no better here. So the boss monster is powerful but near impossible to summon, making it near worthless to the deck. Okay, that's literally every structure deck up to this point. Let's take a look at how this deck supports the supposed Spells Master sub-themes with its burn and spell counter cards, beginning with what should be the more viable of the 2 strategies in its burn damage. First up, we've got the new burn card first released in this deck, Magical Blast. A normal spell, Blast will do 200 points of damage for each spellcaster you control. In addition to this, the card can be added back to your hand each turn by skipping your draw phase. Wow, I remember this deck's burn being bad from back in the day, but I didn't think it would be this bad. So not only do you need to have a full or near full board for this card to do any amount of real damage, you also have to essentially time seal yourself for what is, let's be honest here, an irrelevant amount of burn damage to anyone who has a strong enough field for this card to do anything of value. Because outside of being locked down by something like Gravity Bind, there is no reason a board of spellcasters numerous enough to do 1000 points of damage with this card can't just win through their attack power alone. Next up, we've got slightly better burn in Ebon Magician Kuran. A level 2 monster, this card may look cute, but she is here to cause pain, as during each of the opponent's standby phase, she has a whopping 300 points of damage for each monster they control. Hey, I said it was better burn, not good burn. Sure, you could have a better chance of doing decent damage with this card than Blast, but it still requires at least 3 monsters to do any significant amounts of damage, so again, what's the point when they're probably going to be strong enough to kill you even with this card up? And the final burn card we have to talk about in this section is Rapid Fire Magician, and hallelujah, they actually made a decent burn effect for once. Unlike the previous cards, this card can actually be a really powerful game ender in the right circumstances, as not only does he do a massive 400 points damage per activation, but can do this far more often as his burn happens each time you activate a normal spell, essentially making him an easier to summon and smaller Eradicator Warlock. Yes, technically this card could end a game if you've got enough draw and recovery spells, but let's be honest here, most of the time it'll do about 1200 points of damage, which isn't bad, but not the strongest either. Still, at least this card had potential, which more than can be said for the other burn Drek in this deck. Okay, so the burn damage really isn't that prevalent in this deck. Let's see if the spell counter effects can make up for this. Well, one of the best spell counter cards in this deck is Skill Dark Magician, if that tells you anything. A massive 1900 attack beater, this card gains a spell counter whenever you play a spell card. When it has 3, it can be triggered to summon Dark Magician from the hand or deck. An effect that will never be used, as all this card will likely be used for is as a big beater. Yes, this card can summon Dark Magician, which can be turned into Warlock, but a lot of work has to go right for that to happen. So having this card attack over most good level 4s and below for the time was probably the best use of it. Now, as far as cards that actually use their counters, one of the best ones we have here is Blast Magician, which like Rapid Fire Magician has an explosive effect based on the number of spells you play. In this case, instead of turning mass spell plays into burn damage, this one turns it into removal, by placing spell counters on Blast that can be cashed in to kill a monster whose points are equal to or less to the amount of counters used times 700, meaning 3 spells can take out most cards played at the time, and 2 can take out a large number of them. Now, once we add staples to this deck, in the upgrade section, this card kind of becomes obsolete. I'd rather play guaranteed removal than this, but if you're playing this deck out of the box at a local level, it was a decent piece of repeated removal, if you could protect it. Next up we have Raw Magical Library, which in the wider game is almost exclusively used as an FTK enabler, but in this deck is the best use of spell counters, as each lot of 3 can be cashed in for a card draw effect that's not once per turn. Now with a wider card pool, this card is only used for Exodia plays for the most part. You essentially stack your deck with every card that draws cards, eventually get to this and then draw your whole deck, or nowadays draw once, get drawed and cry. In this deck though, it's mostly just incidental card draw, as you're unlikely to get more than one draw a turn here, which in this context makes this the best card draw this deck has access to, and a perfect example of what I want the spell counter cards to do. Pity the game got so fast that this card was just FTKs, but hey, what can you do? Next we've got a card that may not be anything special, but it did go on to inspire a few powerful cards in the future. It's Mystical Beast Cerberus. Starting at 1400 attack points, this card gains a spell counter whenever you play a spell, and gains 500 attack points for each one of those counters. However, this isn't build your own behemoth here, as when the card attacks, it loses all those counters and all its points, meaning you've got to start all over again. So this card's not amazing, but it is decent. It was clearly designed to be a finisher, or a card to beat over something massive, and can be a way for this deck to deal with She Will Not Be Named after 2 activations. Also, if you don't attack with it and let its counters build, it can be a decent wall to hide behind when you build up your field. In addition to this card was only okay at the time, but inspired 2 powerful pendulum cards that have gone to be one of some of the best cards in the deck in the late 2010s. One being a negate and the other one being a good starter. So I guess it's got a decent legacy if nothing else. Finally we have Breaker the Magical Warrior. We'll talk about him later. All you need to know for now is, it's a good card who falls in the category of spell counter is just there to count effective activations and not much else. We also have the trap card to add more spell counters, but it's so slow and clunky it's really not worth playing. Okay, so the burn cards aren't really doing much and are barely in the deck, while the spell counter theme is more prevalent but are also not that powerful out of the box, with the best cards being mediocre removal and a couple of decent bodies and not much more, with the good cards needing better decks to be built around them. How about the rest of the deck out of the box? Outside of this deck's theme cards, we do have a decent pool of generically good cards to work with, most of which I'll discuss at length in the reprint section. We've got a decent selection here of both aggressive and control pieces, giving us a few ways to go in the next section. Again, I'll be brief here and talk more in detail in the reprint section, so I'll give you a quick overview here. In terms of powerful beaters for attacks, we've got Gemini Elf 1900 attack vanilla, and a pseudo 1900 attack vanilla in Skill Dark Magician, along with Breaker who all start at 1900 attack points, which means it can easily beat over most monsters. As established, we also have Cerberus for Gravekeeper's Spy. We also have a 1 tribute 1200 attack point monster in Chaos Command Magician, a 2300 attack monster remover in Chaos Sorcerer for extra damage and interaction, meaning on the offense this deck, when going against other structures of the era, would be able to win fairly easily in a game where it came down to who has the biggest monster, usually. On the defensive side, we got Magician of Faith, which allows to recur our spells for the grind game, and a Prince Magician can search here, and with them both being at 2, this gives this deck a decent amount of grind. We've also got Raw Magical Library, like I said, for repeated card draw, and Chaos Sorcerer, with being a massive beater on the offense, can also be defensive by removing threats we can't deal with in battle, and so can Blast Magician give it enough time. We also have Tsukiyomi to play both roles, as a way of delaying attacks by flipping power monsters face down, resetting our own flips for repeated use of their effects, and can also help us beat over big monsters like the Monarchs who've got low defense points. In terms of new backrow in this deck, we've got Magical Dimension and Mystic Box for our new removal, and while it was nice when this deck was released to get 2 new cards Yugi played in the anime, one of which being a Duelist Kingdom staple, when translated into the real game they were, to put it generously, underwhelming. Mystic Box was by far the worst of the 2, as not only did it require you to have a monster in your field to destroy an opponent's monster, but also needed to give your monster to the opponent. Now yes, with cards like Tsukiyomi you could turn this into a positive, by having the spirit monsters back to your hand at the end phase, and you could combine this card with spent flip monsters like Faith. However, while it's not too much work to make this card's downside irrelevant, why run this or something like Raigeki Break, which not only is active near enough all the time, but also a common in a precon, making it just as easy to get hold of. Magical Dimension, on the other hand, is marginally better than Box, in that it doesn't require you to give your opponent any resources. Instead, this card is actually first and foremost a summoning effect that allows us to tribute a monster with a spellcaster on the field to summon a different spellcaster from our hand, then as a bonus it pops any monster on the field. Now yes, this is situational removal on a card that, let's be honest here, gets worse and worse the longer the game goes, and the smaller your hand gets. But on the positive, this is another way of cheating out Dark Magician to get your boss out easier, and it's another way of using up an already flipped low power monster like Magician of Faith. In addition, it is a quick play spell, meaning this card can be used both defensively and offensively during the opponent's turn, and if you were to upgrade this deck, it is worth noting that monster tributes doesn't have to be a spellcaster, meaning this card can be used to trigger something like Sangan while filling the grave for Chaos Sorcerer. However, it is still situational removal that we likely will remove upon upgrading this deck, as more guaranteed removal like Mageki Break is much better than situational removal that grows less and less powerful as the player's hand size decreases. Finally, for new spells, we have Nightmare Steel Cage, a continuous spell that stops both players from attacking for 2 turns. Yeah, and I'm going to dignify this one with a response: just placeholder Revealing Light. Not only does it give you 1 extra turn of paralysing your opponent, but doesn't stop you from attacking. Outside of this, the deck has most of the usual generic staples we come to expect at this point, which I'll discuss in the last section, but the one card I want to highlight here, Mage Power. Yes, I guess it's thematically appropriate to have a card with a bunch of wizards on it in this deck, but why would you put a card that requires a lot of back row on the field in a deck that encourages you to play as many normal spells as possible? With barely any continuous cards in the deck, it's not awful, it just seems very out of place, and it's a pretty obvious cut. With our trap cards, we've got 2 good reprints we'll talk about later, and Pitch Dark Power Stone, which like I said is slow but can be used to fuel Breaker for multiple pops by quickly putting new spell counters onto him. We also have Call of the Haunted in its 6th reprint in the Structure Decks, and it's just as good here as it's been in all the other ones, and Spell Shield Type 8, a card that can be either a worse or better magic gem depending on the situation, as if it negates a spell targeting one monster it requires no cost, but any other spell it negates will cost you a discard of a spell card. So this deck has a lot of good cards, however it's also bogged down by a lot of essentially just filler, particularly in the back row, with not only the mediocre removal, but cards designed only to work with Eradicator and Dark Magician, like Dark Magic Attack and Diffusion Wave Motion, along with cards like Spell Absorption that basically do nothing for the most part. In conclusion, Spellcasters Judgement as its own deck is the perfect example of the whole being less than the sum of its parts. This deck has a decent amount of staples, including arguably the strongest monster in the game at this time, along with our really solid back row suite. However, this is mixed with another impossible to summon boss monster, several bricks robbing around a card we can barely play, cards only here to create a theme for the deck that are slow and not worth using, and a lot of cards that are just here to fill space. At this time in Yu-Gi-Oh, where most locals consisted of young players using half-built decks and precons like this, you may have been able to beat other players on similar decks, but even then you'd likely struggle against decks like Zombie Madness, Fury from the Deep, and even Blaze of Destruction would give you a hard time. As I said before, but the most value you'll get from this deck will be mining it for parts. Out of the box, I give it a C+. So I think we've established that this deck's inbuilt strategies aren't particularly good, so for the upgrade section I will not be giving an in-depth breakdown on improving either the burn or spell counter themes. Yes, we could improve this deck by adding better burn cards like Wave Motion Cannon, which does use spell counters, and playing cards like Gravity Bind, but at that point, just bring out the panda and be done with it. Now we could also expand on the spell counter theme by playing a more focused Royal Magical Library deck, but 1, that really isn't an expansion of this deck's themes, and 2, I'll be dead for you to be proposing an FTK on this channel. The only real way to improve this deck is to lean more heavily on Spellcaster aggro if we want to keep a lot of its cards in. By first maxing out on the good beaters we had in this deck, like Skull Magician and Gemini Elf, as well as adding in Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, and 800 beta that can take out graveyards. These beaters are the ones that can take out any non-spy, non-tribute at the time, and they can also handle the increasingly popular Monarchs if we have a Tsukiyomi. In addition to this, cards like Chaos Command Magician who can't be targeted, and Chaos Sorcerer act as the deck's boss monsters, and some decks like this have even maxed out on the Dark Magician, using a Toon Table of Contents package to more reliably deck thin and get skill addition to 3 counters, which means yes, you can also play Eradicator in this build as well. Adding on to this, we have Old Vindictive Magician, a spellcaster Manita bug, who along with Tsukiyomi is a great way to out big monsters, and you can even supplement this with a small warrior package, as we are just seeing on screen now. Finally, if you were in the Dark Magician build, it's probably best to add on extra spells like the Trinity, Book of Moon, and some run My Body as a Shield to defend skilled while getting its counters up. This, along with an Awana Crossout to take out face-down threats like Spy and enemy control staples, Premature Burial for recursion, Lightning Vortex for monster removal, and Heavy Storm and MST for back row hate, all in the pre-con, made this deck a really powerful deck for locals at the time. Now, some builds that were heavy on Dark Magician also ran 1000 Knives and kept in Dark Magic attack for extra removal of both monsters and back row, but they need Dark Magician to be on the field to work, a card you weren't guaranteed to get. Run those at your own risk of bricking. Now, this seems okay on the surface. You get a nice selection of beaters, powerful goat staples, and a bunch of cheap removal with ability to splash in Chaos Sorcerer if you wish, and your Tsukiyomi Captive with Monarchs, some of the best cards at the time. Sounds like a pretty strong deck. Well, yes, it is decently powerful and could definitely win you a locals back then. The problem is, why bother doing this? When at its best, this deck will still fall to better aggro decks like Earth Aggro, Beast Down, and Warrior Toolbox, which feature types and attributes mostly used for aggressive game plans, but more importantly can outgrade Keeper's Spy in battle without relying on removal as much as we would have to here, and in Warrior's case, it's just as cheap thanks to their own Structure Deck reprinting all their staples about the same time as this deck came out. So I was ready to give this section a low D and call it a day, but then I started to look closer and realised that while the strategy the deck's creators wanted it to have isn't really salvageable, and the deck you could build using a large portion of this deck was outclassed by most other decks in its category, the creators of this deck accidentally gave us another strategy we can build from the cards we have. You see, Spellcasters are far better at control than aggro, and one particular control deck was doing really well this time, even with Monarchs and Cyber Dragon tearing up the meta. Namely, this deck gave players the building blocks for Chaos. Now, Chaos decks dominated much of the mid-2000s Yu-Gi-Oh!, so much so in fact that the first version of the deck was what created the very first ban list in the first place, and by the time of this deck's release, the deck was in its twilight years, with BLS and CD already banned, and many of its other pieces either banned or limited. And yet it was arguably still the best deck in the game, and thanks to this deck, it became semi-budget, with many of its core cards getting reprinted. Beginning with the new face of this deck, we got a common copy of Chaos Sorcerer, a card that somehow was still at 3 at this point. Now, admittedly, this card wasn't too hard to pull from Invasion of Chaos or Dark Revelations packs, but this deck was the first time the card was guaranteed, which made it great for kids like me who hadn't used the internet to buy single cards much yet. Hey, give me a break, it was the mid-2000s. For those who don't know, Sorcerer costs 1 light and 1 dark to summon, has 300 attack points, and once per turn can banish 1 visited monster at the cost of its attack that turn. Now, while it's underpowered compared to its kin, Sorcerer was so strong enough to make Chaos a top deck in late 05, early 06, when this deck came out, as it could banish bigger and more problematic monsters like the Monarchs, DD Warrior Lady, and Floaters, while beating over almost everything else in the game at the time. And somehow despite this, like I said, this card was still at 3, and the head of a deck that used all the good light and darks at the time, along with Return from the Different Dimension, to clear fields and then swing for game fairly quickly. Up next, we've got the only spell counter card to be a real meta threat in Breaker the Magical Warrior, a 600 attack monster that has 2 very powerful effects. Firstly, upon summoning, it gains 1 spell counter which gives it 300 extra attack points, and it can remove that counter to pop any back row, making this card both a massive beater and an MST on legs. Not only was this card good in Chaos, it was good in pretty much every deck at this time. In fact, it got banned several times between now and 2008 for some weird reason. As a control deck, Petition of Faith's ability to recur spells is vitally important to drag the game into deep waters versus aggro Monarch decks, and with 2 copies of Faith and 2 copies of Reprint's position in the pre-con, this deck would have saved players a little bit of money back in the day, as no extra copies would be needed due to the card's semi-limited status. The same goes for Tsukiyomi, as while Chaos was arguably the best deck, the one other deck with legitimate claim to that crown at the time was Monarch, and while all of them were immensely powerful, they also had a very serious drawback of only 1000 defense points, making them easy to run over by Pokemoning them with this spirit, who was hard to remove because she kept bouncing back to your hand during each of your end steps. In addition to this, many of the cards this deck played that weren't in this deck had either been reprinted in other structures and starter decks, like most of the back row, or were fairly cheap at this time, like Night Assailant, Treeborn Frog, Mystic Tomato, Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, and Return from the Different Dimension, which was in the movie pack. And even the more expensive cards like Cyber Dragon got a reprint fairly soon after this deck's release. Now granted, some builds of this deck play Cyberstein so they get FTK with Cyber Twin Dragon, but this was optional, so you didn't need to fork over that much money to build a semi-competitive version of this deck. So to sum it up, while this deck's spell counter and spell burn themes are basically unupgradable at this time, the fact that this deck had most of the game's best spellcasters, which were the second best type in the game at this time, meant that with a little investment into other structure deck cards and a couple of pricey pickups, you could either get a decent locals deck or one of the best decks of its era depending on your budget. I would give this section an A, but I think the heavy amount you need to invest to get the top tier deck in this situation, with cards like Silver Dragon and Cyberstein, brings it down to a high B. Okay, this deck is actually a lot better than I remember, to be honest with you. Can we stick the landing with the reprints? Let's find out. Finally, let's take a look at the reprints from this deck. However, before we do, I just want to state how I'll be judging this section from this point on. Yes, these decks in the early years all came with good staple reprints. However, something I come to realise is, if that staple is available in most of these decks, there really isn't a massive point for, say, Dragon's Roar's quality, when the much better Zombie Madness also has the same cards in it. So going forward, it'll be a point for a deck if it has a lot of good staples, but I'll rank it higher if the deck has one of the first easy to get reprints of a said staple, as that would actually make the deck a better purchase than another one. So for example, this deck was the first chance many younger and budget players had to get their hands on Breaker the Magical Warrior, which had 3 printings prior to this, but always a super rare or higher, making this a great time for budget players to pick up one back in the day. This gave all players both a big beater and another way to out back row that wasn't MST, and given how popular Burn was at this time, that was a pretty good reprint. Another card getting its first easy to access reprint here was Chaos Command Magician, a card printed first in the same set as Breaker prior to this deck, with also being an Ultra and a Super in its first 2 sets before getting a Tournament Pack reprint and then this deck for a Mass reprint. Now this card is not as good as Breaker, but it being 2400 attack points for 1 tribute with the ability to negate any effect that targeted him, made him a card sometimes played in both Chaos, Go Control and Monarch decks back in the day for his ability to resist cards like Snatch Steal. Finally, for expensive reprints, we have the first major reprint of Magic Cylinder. Yes, nowadays this card is a massive joke and considered a big noob trap, seeing as all it does is negate an attack and do damage with no effects on the board. However, in 2005 and 2006, not only was Burn one of the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but also arguably the best choice for budget and new players, due to its cheap cards and no extra deck for the former, and the simplicity of the strategy for the latter. And Cylinder could often deal a killing blow in this deck, as the Tall Flame Pan was built around doing a ton of effect damage. Adding on to this card actually got a lot stronger in late 2006, due to the rise of both Stein decks and Cyber Dragon decks, as the former reduced their own life points significantly to bring out monsters with massive stats, and the latter used cards like Power Bond and limited removal to make monsters with 5k or more attack. So this being the former exclusively Secret Rare's first successful print was a massive selling point for this deck. Now these are the expensive and first time reprints from this deck, but we do have other really powerful cards to talk about here. Most prominently we've got Chaos Sorcerer, which is printed in common in Invasion of Chaos, but with that set being over a year old at this point, and with Sork arguably not being the best monster in the game after his big brother's bannings, giving players another easy crack at him was another good reason for players to get this deck. With his massive 2300 attack body, easy summon condition, and ability to remove one monster as long as he didn't attack, Sork was arguably the best monster in the game at this point, and Chaos Control is still one of the best decks, thanks to all the good generic Light and Dark cards. And for some reason this card was still at 3 copies, so this deck made it very easy to get that playset to get closer to building one of the best decks in the game at the time. Now, like Chaos Sork, Tsukimi was not a hard card to pull, having being a rare in Dark Crisis and a common on its first reprint, but it also hadn't been reprinted in around a year at this point, making this another welcome inclusion. As 1100 attack points and its Book of Moon effect, this card was an ideal way to counter Monarch, the second or third best deck at the time. Yeah, you may well call this card Tsukimi the Monarch Slayer, as any Monarch summoned with this card in your hand was just dead, as you summoned this, flipped the mark to 1000 defense points, attacked over it, and then bounced this spirit back to your hand, meaning the opponent had to waste quick effect removal on this card over some of its better targets. As I've shown in previous sections, we have some other notable reprints, like Royal Magical Library, the FTK enabling Terror of Goat, and later Yu-Gi-Oh! That let you draw a card for every 3 spells you cast, making it an Exodia searching machine when played with a bunch of draw spells. Skills Adaptation was a good beta like I mentioned. Magician of Faith is one of the best cards in the game at this point for control decks, being able to recur spells. And of course, Apprentice Magician gave you 2 more copies of her, which is really good considering at this point she was at 2 copies herself. Now all these cards weren't high demand reprints, as they all had been either printed in starter decks or at low rarity, but were all really good meta cards at this time, so including them with these more valuable cards definitely made the structure deck more desirable. Now when it comes to the back row reprints, I'll be honest, while they are good, there isn't anything here that could sell you this deck over any of the previous ones, as most of these cards were available in most structure decks prior to this. Heavy Storm and its back row field wipe effect is once more present, as is Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted, with their monster reviving powers. MST and Dust Tornado are here for more back row hate, and we also have No Mana Crossout and Swords of Revealing Light, which begs the question why we also have Nightmare Steel Cage, but never mind. There were, however, 2 back row cards in this deck that weren't well available prior to its release, the first being Lightning Vortex, which received its first reprint in this cycle of structure decks. Now I covered this card at length in my Go For My Ban List guide recently, but to summarise, this weaker Raigeki can wipe all face-up monsters the opponent controls, at the cost of a discard, which is not only very powerful in any deck, but gives control decks like the Chaos one we were building earlier an advantage they really needed against more aggressive decks. Like I said in the ban list video, the fact that this card can't hit face-down monsters and can be recurred with Magician of Faith helps give control a leg up on aggro, which it really needs. You see, usually, aggressive decks have an inherent advantage over control, because they're simpler, faster, and can play more powerful cards like Solemn Judgement, so giving control this one card they can recur against that deck to get to the late game is pretty good. And plus, aggro can still use it, and with all its power against control, I think giving them this one bone is fair. The second back row card to get its first accessible reprint in this deck was Divine Wrath. A counter trap that was only printed as a super rare in Rise of Destiny, this card acts like a first draft of more powerful counter traps we'd see later, Solemn Strike. This is because for the cost of a discard, this card could negate any monster effect and destroy said monster. Now was this a top tier trap? No, not really. But if you're on a budget, you could do a lot worse than situational removal that could also stop any effect. In conclusion, this deck honestly has some really good reprints. Yes, they do kind of steal the spotlight from the new cards and main themes of this deck, but compared to what's coming up later on in this series, it's nice to have something to recommend it back in the day. From giving players the very early building blocks for Chaos, to giving every deck access to universal staples, to just reprinting again a lot of good back row and monsters, I'm surprisingly giving this section of the deck an A. In conclusion, Spellcasters Judgement is the second worst of these decks I've covered so far, as while it did lower the price of several staples at the time and give players the very basic building blocks for Chaos, it didn't have much to offer as a deck out of the box, and needed a lot of work to improve it to make it good with upgrades. Like I showed, the best it can offer is Spellcaster Aggro / Damnation Turbo on a budget, and as far as aggro goes, it's outclassed by literally any other good aggro deck at the time. Not to mention that aggro was starting to drop off in terms of popularity thanks to the rise of Monarchs, and the continued prevalence of Chaos, so even if this was a good aggro deck, it wouldn't do that much to improve the value of this deck. Now yes, I get the building blocks for Chaos, with reducing the price of some of the staples, but that deck at full power was still quite pricey, so this deck only gets half points for that. Now that being said, it's still light years ahead of Dragon's Roar, as the Spellcasters being far better supported than Dragons at this point. The reprints were much better, and as bad as it was, at least we have strategy in this deck beyond just summon big boss, pray there's no removal. Again, like I said at the beginning, this deck is essentially just a reprint pack with a bunch of bulk. However, as its reprints were really good, I can't call this deck a failure, and with it being a decent stepping stone into building a top tier meta deck, I'm giving this deck a B. And that was the Spellcasters Judgement structure deck, and believe it or not, it's the best one we're going to be seeing for a while on this series. In fact, next time, we'll be covering what we consider to be the worst structure deck of all time. See you next time, everybody.